today I wanted to talk with you a little bit about Spotify and kind of debate, is Spotify bad for jazz musicians? First of all, I'd like to say that I'm basically a Spotify convert. I was totally against all the streaming platforms for a long time. So if that's the way that you currently feel, I completely understand that. I just want to get a few points across for you to maybe think about, kind of debate. First of all, I'd like to cover several of the common Spotify myths. The first myth is that they simply don't pay musicians. And the truth of the matter is they do pay musicians. I could show you my spreadsheets. Some musicians actually make really good money on Spotify. Many of these are independent musicians. You need a lot more people than you would for album or CD sales to make the same amount of money. But it's false to say they don't pay musicians and that none of the musicians make any money. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, the other myth is that they pay less than all the other streaming services, Spotify in particular. Actually, YouTube is a much bigger streaming service than Spotify, and YouTube pays musicians much less than Spotify. So it's not true that Spotify is the lowest paying. The third one is, it simply isn't possible to make as much money from streaming as you would from album or CD sales. That's another myth. The truth is that yes, you do need a lot more people and you need a lot of streams. But it is possible to make more money from streaming services than from album and CD sales if you have enough people, if you have enough streams. The fourth myth is that you're losing money every time someone streams your music, because if they hadn't streamed the music, they would have bought from you and you would have made more money. The truth of the matter is, we have no idea whether the person that streamed your music would have bought it or not. A lot of them would not have bought it, regardless. So we can't always assume that. Some people would have bought it, some people wouldn't. But anyway, the fifth myth is that now that streaming is here, no one is buying CDs or records anymore. And the truth of the matter is that record and CD sales are up currently. There's a lot of people who either want to own the product itself, or in many cases they still want to really support an artist. So those are all some of the major myths anyway. The biggest disadvantages for jazz musicians, as I see it, first of all, I mentioned before, you do need a much bigger group of listeners to make money than you would selling CDs and albums. That's definitely true. So that's a disadvantage. You will also lose some potential sales for sure, since people can now stream your music, free or really cheaply. So those are the two biggest disadvantages I see. Now, here's some of the advantages that I see. First of all, for me personally, it's easy for jazz musicians now to study and learn their craft. I grew up in a small town in the middle of nowhere. So if you said to me, man, you really got to check out, Elvin Jones is playing with John Coltrane, there was literally nowhere I could go to listen to that. None of the record stores in my area would carry that record. And now I have instant access to literally anything I can think of on the internet. So for me, that's a tremendous advantage as a jazz musician. It also encourages more listening. Having the streaming services does. It encourages more listening to more music and more artists, especially independent artists. In the past, jazz radio had a limited number of artists they could play. There were only so many stations, and they had a certain number of hours per day to play a certain number of artists. With the streaming, there are an unlimited amount of playlists, and therefore there's room for an unlimited number of artists. Jazz listeners can also listen to an unlimited number of artists, as it isn't costing them every time they listen. Therefore, it's easier for larger numbers of independent musicians to succeed than it ever was before. It's easier to develop a listening audience than it ever was before as well. It's much easier to ask someone to just click a button than it is to ask them to pull out their wallet and, pay for your CD or your album. So it's easier to grow your audience in that respect. Jazz musicians now have unlimited distribution of their music to every city in the world and every country. In the past, it simply wasn't possible for most musicians. Someone had to pay to print, to manufacture all those albums and CDs. Then they had to be shipped to all those stores in all those cities all over the world. And, unless you had a big label behind you, most people simply couldn't afford to do that. So your music just wasn't available to a lot of people in the past as an independent musician, And then you hope that people would actually buy them. With streaming, it costs absolutely nothing for an independent musician to distribute their music all over the world. So that's one huge advantage now. The barrier to entry has also been removed. In the past, you had to have a record label to distribute your music, and again, these labels could only take so many artists. Sometimes the really talented got signed, sometimes they didn't. In some cases, the really talented people weren't signed because the labels didn't feel their music was commercial enough. They thought if they had it printed, they wouldn't sell enough, they wouldn't recoup their investment. But because of today's streaming technology along with recording, those creative boundaries are removed. You don't necessarily need a label at all today. And anyone who has a professional sounding recording can put it on Spotify and other streaming services. You don't even need permission from the radio stations. You're free to create as you choose. So those are some of my thoughts on the subject. Let me know what you think. Also, I want to mention that I do have a new single coming out on Spotify on March 30th. And this is a quirky tune about a troubled guy having a heart-to-heart with his therapist. And you can pre-save it to your Spotify account by clicking the link in the comments below or following the link in my Instagram bio. And I want to just thank you for watching. And again, let me know what you think.